Imagine waking up one morning and learning that your name is not your name. That the parents who raised you were not your parents. That the house you grew up in, the photographs on the wall, the family stories you heard at dinner, the surname you signed at the bottom of every document across your entire life, none of it belonged to you. That somewhere in your past, before you were old enough to have memories, a mistake was made. A terrible, irreversible mistake that reached forward through the decades and shaped everything you became. Now imagine that you never found out. That is what happened to Bobby Dunbar. Or rather, and this is the part that will stay with you, that is what happened to the boy who spent his entire life being called Bobby Dunbar. In August 1912, a 4-year-old child disappeared during a family fishing trip at Swayze Lake in Louisiana. The whole of St. Landry Parish searched for him. His parents searched for him. 8 months passed, and then a boy was found in Mississippi in the company of an itinerant handyman, and the family came to claim him, and they said, "That is our son. That is Bobby." A man went to prison for kidnapping. The family went home with their boy, and the boy grew up. He had children. His children had children. His children's children grew up knowing exactly who they were and where they came from and what their name meant. In 2004, one of those grandchildren arranged a DNA test. The result came back, and it said one thing with complete clarity. The man who had lived his entire life as Bobby Dunbar was not Bobby Dunbar. He never had been. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists to tell the stories that history buried so deep that even the people living inside them never knew the truth. If that is the kind of story that makes you need to keep watching, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, and it means these stories keep getting told. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened to Bobby Dunbar, you have to understand the world he disappeared from. Because that world, rural Louisiana in 1912, its social structures, its racial hierarchies, its assumptions about who could be believed and who could not, is not incidental background to this story. It is the story's engine. The Dunbar family were people of standing in St. Landry Parish. Percy Dunbar was a respected man in the community. His wife Leslie was known as a devoted mother. They had several children, and Bobby, Robert Clarence Dunbar, born in 1908, was their youngest. By the accounts of everyone who knew them, they were a solid, respectable, prosperous family of the kind that formed the backbone of small-city Louisiana life in the early 20th century. In August 1912, the family went on a fishing trip to Swayze Lake, near Opelousas. It was the kind of trip families took in the Louisiana summer, hot days by the water, the children running along the bank, the adults watching from the shade. At some point during the trip, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar was there. And then, he was not. The family searched immediately. The lake was dragged. The surrounding land was combed. Neighbors joined the search. Law enforcement was brought in. The story spread quickly through the parish. A child was missing, a young boy, the Dunbar boy, last seen by the water's edge at Swayze Lake. The search continued for days and then for weeks, and then, as the weeks turned to months, it became something different from a search. It became a vigil, a sustained and desperate refusal by the Dunbar family to stop looking and accept the worst. Bobby was not found. Not that summer. Not in the autumn. The winter came, and the case went cold in the way that cases went cold in 1912. Not through any official closure, but through the simple exhaustion of resources and attention and hope. Percy and Leslie Dunbar lived with an absence where their youngest child had been. The community grieved with them. And the question of what had happened to Bobby Dunbar settled into the permanent unresolved category of things that the parish would always wonder about and never know. Then, in February 1913, 6 months after Bobby disappeared, a telegram arrived. A boy had been found in Mississippi, near Hub in Pike County. He was traveling with a man named William Cantwell Walters, a wandering handyman and musician who moved through the rural South playing at local gatherings and doing odd jobs, the kind of man who existed on the margins of Southern society, known in communities but not belonging fully to any of them. The boy traveling with him was young. He appeared to be about 4 years old. He could not clearly account for himself, and somebody who saw him thought he looked like the missing Dunbar child. The telegram reached Percy Dunbar. He traveled to Mississippi to see the boy. What happened at that meeting, in the specific human moments of a father looking at a child and deciding whether that child is his, is documented in newspaper accounts that were written with the certainty of people who had already decided what the story was. Percy Dunbar looked at the boy and identified him as his son. Later, Leslie Dunbar came to Mississippi and identified him too. The boy, it was reported, recognized his mother. He reached for her. He called her by a family name. The newspapers declared it a miracle. William Cantwell Walters was arrested immediately. He was charged with kidnapping Bobby Dunbar from Swayze Lake. He told the authorities from the first moment of his arrest that the boy was not Bobby Dunbar. He said the child's name was Bruce Anderson. He said the boy's mother was a woman named Julia Anderson, a single mother from North Carolina whom Walters knew as a family friend. He said Julia had asked him to take Bruce with him on his travels for a time while she found work. He said there had been no kidnapping. The boy was not the Dunbar child. He had never been to Louisiana in his life. Nobody believed him. And in the social architecture of the rural American South in 1913, where a man like William Cantwell Walters, poor and itinerant and rootless, was exactly the kind of man that respectable families needed to be protected from, nobody was particularly interested in hearing his side of it with any care. A woman named Julia Anderson did come forward. She came from North Carolina. She said the boy was her son Bruce. She had not been married to the child's father. She was poor. She had left Bruce in the care of Walters, whom she knew and trusted, while she worked. She was there. She saw the boy. She said, "That is my child." The Dunbar's lawyer arranged for her to examine the boy without being told in advance whether the Dunbars had identified him as Bobby. She looked at the child carefully, and then she said, and this moment sits in the historical record like a stone, she was not certain. She could not be sure. That moment of uncertainty destroyed her case. The Dunbars took the boy back to Louisiana. Walters went to trial. He was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison. The community celebrated. The newspapers wrote about a mother's love and a family restored. The boy went home to Opelousas and was enrolled in school and grew up and played sport and had friends and became, by every outward measure, Bobby Dunbar. He lived as Bobby Dunbar for the rest of his life. He died in 1966, never knowing otherwise. Before we go further, if you are still with me, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I always find it interesting to know where these stories are reaching. Take a breath. We are about to go somewhere darker. The boy who came home to the Dunbar family in 1913 was given everything that a beloved child of a prosperous Louisiana family could expect. He was enrolled in school. He was raised with care. He had the Dunbar name, the Dunbar history, the Dunbar social standing. When he was old enough, he married. He had children. He built a life in Louisiana and then later in Mississippi, a life entirely consistent with the family he believed he belonged to. He was known as Bobby Dunbar for the rest of his days. William Cantwell Walters served years in prison before being paroled in 1921. The records around his imprisonment and eventual release are incomplete. This was a rural southern county in the early 20th century, and the documentation of the criminal justice system in that time and place was not thorough. What is clear is that he went to prison for taking a child across state lines. What is also clear is that he maintained from the first day of his arrest to the last day of his imprisonment that he had not taken Bobby Dunbar anywhere. He had been caring for Bruce Anderson, with that child's mother's knowledge and permission, and the child had been taken from him by people who were wrong. Julia Anderson's life after 1913 is harder to trace. She was a poor, unmarried woman from rural North Carolina in the early 20th century, exactly the kind of person whose movements and experiences the historical record was not designed to preserve. What is known is that she did not stop insisting the boy was hers. She made statements. She gave interviews. She continued for years after the Dunbars took the child back to Louisiana to say publicly that a mistake had been made and that Bruce Anderson was being raised by the wrong family. Nobody with the power to do anything about it listened. The reasons for that are not complicated, though they are deeply uncomfortable to sit with. Julia Anderson was poor. She was unmarried and had a child from a relationship that respectable Southern society in 1913 judged harshly. She had, at the critical moment of identification, expressed uncertainty rather than absolute certainty. The Dunbars, by contrast, were respected and established and devastated by the loss of their child, and a community that had followed their grief for 8 months was not inclined to take that grief away from them based on the claims of a woman like Julia Anderson. This is how the powerful story of a family reunited became the story of a woman nobody would believe. There is another dimension to this that needs to be stated directly. The boy at the center of the identification had no reliable way to resolve it himself. He was 4 years old when Bobby Dunbar disappeared. He was not yet 5 when the found boy was brought to Mississippi. Children of that age do not have stable, reliable memories of their early lives. They are extraordinarily susceptible to suggestion, to the warmth of an adult's expectation, to the emotional weight of a room full of people who need them to be a specific person. A 4-year-old boy, handed to a weeping woman who calls herself his mother and reaches for him with complete conviction, is going to respond to that. He is going to reach back. He is going to say the names that are offered to him. Whether he was Bobby Dunbar or Bruce Anderson, the child in that room in Mississippi in 1913 responded to Leslie Dunbar, because a child responds to what is presented to him with love and certainty. That response was not evidence. It was the behavior of a small child in a confusing situation. But it was reported as evidence, treated as evidence, and used as the foundation of a conviction that sent William Cantwell Walters to prison. The decades passed. Bobby Dunbar, the man living as Bobby Dunbar, built his life. He was a well-liked man. His son, also named Bobby, grew up in Mississippi. Bobby Jr. had children of his own. The Dunbar name carried forward, generation by generation, through a family that had no reason to question who they were. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, something began to shift. A woman named Margaret Dunbar Cutright, the granddaughter of Percy and Leslie Dunbar, became interested in her family's history. She was a researcher by inclination, the kind of person who finds the gaps in family stories more interesting than the stories themselves. And the Bobby Dunbar case, when she began to look at it seriously, was full of gaps. The newspaper accounts from 1913 were triumphant and certain in the way that newspaper accounts of the era were when a good story presented itself. But underneath the triumph, if you looked carefully, there were the traces of Julia Anderson's claim. There were the details that did not quite fit. There was the moment of uncertainty that had destroyed her case but had not, if you looked at it honestly, actually resolved the question. Margaret Cutright began corresponding with researchers and journalists. She began pulling documents. She began asking the question that the triumphant newspaper accounts of 1913 had not been designed to accommodate. What if the family had been wrong? Here is what the 1913 identification actually rested on. Percy Dunbar had not seen his son in 8 months when he went to Mississippi to identify him. 8 months is a long time in the life of a 4-year-old child. Children change rapidly at that age. Their faces change, their proportions change. The specific features that a parent holds in their memory shift and develop in ways that make a definitive visual identification after 8 months genuinely uncertain. The birthmarks and physical characteristics that the Dunbars cited to confirm the boy's identity were documented after the identification had already been made, not before. The family said he had certain marks. Those marks were then found on the boy. But the sequence matters enormously. You cannot confirm an identification using physical characteristics that you yourself describe after you have already decided who the child is. Nobody at the time found this sequence troubling. The experts who might have, doctors, legal authorities, were not asked to evaluate the identification process independently. They were asked to confirm what the family had already decided, and a man went to prison on that foundation. Margaret Dunbar Cutright's research eventually connected her with a journalist named Tal McThenia and a legal scholar named Margaret Dunbar, who were separately working on the Bobby Dunbar case from a different direction. through the Anderson family, through descendants of Julia Anderson, through the people on the other side of the identification who had been carrying a different version of this story for 90 years. Julia Anderson had a son who survived into adulthood. Not Bruce, or rather, not the child who had been taken. She had other children. And within that family, the story had been passed down in the way that stories are passed down in families who have been wronged and have no official record to vindicate them. The story was, Bruce was taken. He was raised by the wrong family. Julia was not believed. And the man who had been caring for him went to prison for something he did not do. That story had been kept alive for 90 years inside the Anderson family. Not loudly, not publicly. Quietly, the way painful truths are kept when the world has decided it is not interested in hearing them. The question was whether there was now, in the early 21st century, a way to test it. There was. DNA technology had transformed the investigation of historical cases in the years since its introduction. Familial DNA testing, comparing genetic material between people who believe they may be related to establish or rule out biological connection, had been used to resolve questions that documentation and memory could not. The Bobby Dunbar case was exactly the kind of case it had been designed for. If the boy who came home to Louisiana in 1913 was genuinely Bobby Dunbar, then his descendants would share genetic material with the descendants of Bobby Dunbar's biological siblings, Percy and Leslie's other children, whose families had continued forward in Louisiana. If the boy was Bruce Anderson, they would not. Bobby Jr., the son of the man who had lived as Bobby Dunbar, agreed to provide a DNA sample. A sample was also obtained from a descendant of one of Bobby Dunbar's biological siblings, a person whose connection to the Dunbar family was not in question. The comparison was made. The results came back in 2004. The two samples were not related, not closely related, not distantly related, not related at all. The man who had lived his entire life as Bobby Dunbar, who had died in 1966, believing he knew exactly who he was, had not shared a single identifiable segment of genetic material with the family whose name he carried for 53 years. The boy who came home to Louisiana in 1913 was not Bobby Dunbar. Julia Anderson had been telling the truth. William Cantwell Walters had gone to prison for a crime that did not happen. And the real Bobby Dunbar, the 4-year-old who disappeared at Swayze Lake in August 1912, had never been found. His fate is unknown to this day. Whether he drowned in the lake and his body was never recovered, whether he wandered away and was lost in the Louisiana wilderness, whether something more deliberate happened to him, none of it has ever been established. He is simply absent from the record. A child who was there and then was not, and whose story was displaced by another child's story for 92 years. The news broke in 2004, with the particular force that comes when a truth that has been waiting for a very long time finally arrives. The Dunbar family, the descendants of the man who had lived as Bobby, received the news in different ways. Some found it devastating. Their family history, their identity, the stories they had told themselves about who they were and where they came from. All of it now sat in a different light. Others approached it with a kind of careful pragmatism. The man they called grandfather had been a real person regardless of what his DNA said. He had loved them. They had loved him. The name might have been wrong. The love was not. But in the Anderson family, something else was happening. 90 years of being told you were wrong. 90 years of a story kept alive in private because the public had already decided what had happened. And now, in 2004, a laboratory result that said what Julia Anderson had said in 1913, "That boy is mine." Here is what the DNA result could not tell anyone. It confirmed that the found boy was not Bobby Dunbar. It confirmed almost certainly that the found boy was Bruce Anderson, Julia's child, the child Walters had been legally and legitimately caring for. But it could not answer the question underneath that question. What happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? Because the DNA result did not solve a case. It dissolved one. It removed the answer that the community had accepted in 1913 and replaced it with a void. The found boy was not Bobby. Therefore, Bobby was never found. Therefore, everything that was done in Bobby's name, the trial, The conviction, the imprisonment of Walters, the silencing of Julia Anderson, was done in pursuit of a resolution that was not a resolution at all. It was a substitution. And somewhere in rural Louisiana, in a lake or a field or a road or a history that has been closed for 112 years, the real Bobby Dunbar is still waiting to be accounted for. The story of Bobby Dunbar and Bruce Anderson sits at the intersection of several things that the early 20th century American South was not equipped to handle honestly. It sits at the intersection of class and credibility. Julia Anderson was a poor, unmarried woman. William Cantwell Walters was a rootless handyman. The Dunbar family were prosperous and respected. In any dispute between those two worlds, the social architecture of the time determined who would be believed before a single word of testimony was given. The trial of William Walters was not a weighing of evidence. It was a confirmation of a social conclusion that had already been reached. The right kind of family claimed a child. The wrong kind of man was in possession of that child. The outcome was determined by those facts long before any court convened. It also sits at the intersection of grief and perception. Percy and Leslie Dunbar had spent 8 months in the kind of sustained anguish that only a parent who has lost a child can fully understand. When they saw that boy in Mississippi, they needed him to be Bobby, with a desperation that is entirely human and entirely understandable. The human mind, under that kind of grief, does not operate with clinical precision. It finds what it is looking for. It fills in the gaps between memory and reality with hope. That is not a moral failing. It is a description of how grief and need and love operate in the human mind. But it does not make the outcome any less catastrophic for the people who were destroyed by it. William Cantwell Walters spent years in a Louisiana prison for taking a child he did not take. The historical record does not show that he ever received any official acknowledgement that the state had been wrong. He died. The exact date and circumstances are not fully documented, without vindication. Julia Anderson spent decades being the woman who claimed someone else's child. Her reputation, her credibility, her story, all of it was filtered through the lens of the official narrative, which had decided she was either mistaken or dishonest. She maintained her position. She kept the story alive within her family. She did not live to see the DNA result that proved her right. She had been dead for decades by 2004. The man who lived as Bobby Dunbar died in 1966. He was 57 years old. His death certificate says Bobby Dunbar. His grave marker says Bobby Dunbar. He lived a full life with a name and a history, and a family that were not originally his. Whether he ever had any private doubt, any moment of uncertainty about who he was, any memory from those earliest years that did not quite fit the family story, is not known. He left no documented record of suspicion or confusion. He appears to have lived as Bobby Dunbar with complete conviction, because as far as he knew, that was who he was. And that, perhaps, is the thing that is most difficult to sit with in this entire story. He did not suffer in the way that knowing would have caused him to suffer. He was spared the knowledge. But the sparing was not merciful. It was accidental. It was the outcome of a system that was so certain of its own conclusion in 1913 that it never created any mechanism by which the truth could have reached him. He was protected from the truth not by anyone's kindness, but by everyone's certainty. And certainty, in this case, was indistinguishable from a lie. His son Bobby Jr. received the DNA results in 2004. He was an old man by then. He had lived his entire life as Bobby Dunbar's son. The result told him that the grandfather, whose name he never knew, the biological grandfather on his father's side, was not Percy Dunbar. It was a man he had never heard of, the father of a child named Bruce Anderson, born to a woman in North Carolina who had tried for years to get her son back and had been told she was wrong. Bobby Jr. spoke to journalists after the results were released. He was measured and thoughtful, and clearly in the process of integrating something enormous into the story he told himself about who he was. He said that his father had been a good man, a real father, that the DNA could not change what had actually been lived. He was right, and he was also holding something that cannot be resolved. Because the goodness of the man who raised him, and the reality of the life that man lived, does not undo what was taken from Bruce Anderson, when he was handed to a different family at the age of 4. It does not undo what was taken from Julia Anderson. It does not undo the years William Walters spent in prison. It does not bring back the real Bobby Dunbar, who has never been found and may never be. The truth arrived 92 years late, and like all truths that arrive that late, it could not fix anything. It could only name what had been broken. There is a question I keep coming back to when I think about this case. It is not about the DNA. It is not about the trial. It is not even about the two women, Leslie Dunbar, who needed so desperately to believe, and Julia Anderson, who told the truth for decades and was not believed. It is about the boy. Whichever boy he was, Bobby or Bruce, Louisiana or North Carolina, Dunbar or Anderson. There was a moment in Mississippi in 1913 when he was 4 years old and standing in a room full of adults who were deciding his fate. And he had no language for what was happening to him. He had no way to say, "I do not know these people." He had no way to say, "That woman is not my mother." If he had memories of a different life, a mother in North Carolina, a man named Walters who carried him across the South, those memories were not trusted. They were not asked for. They were overwritten by the certainty of the adults around him who had already decided what the story was. He became Bobby Dunbar because a room full of people needed him to be Bobby Dunbar. And the real Bobby Dunbar was never found because once that room had its answer, nobody went looking anymore. William Cantwell Walters walked out of prison in 1921 into a world that had already moved on. Julia Anderson carried her truth into a silence that lasted until a laboratory in 2004 finally said what she had been saying since 1913. And somewhere in Louisiana, in a lake, in a field, in a piece of history that has been closed for more than a century, a 4-year-old boy is still missing. His name was Bobby Dunbar. Nobody has ever found him. Nobody is looking. The truth in this story waited 92 years for a DNA test. 3 people whose lives were destroyed by the wrong answer in 1913 never lived to see the right one. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, share it with one person today. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below. Tell me who you think the real Bobby Dunbar was. Tell me what you think happened at Swayze Lake in 1912. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.